Hundreds of protesters arrested this weekend. The national count up to as much as 2,963 by one count. Police using pepper spray, mace, even bulldozers to clear protesters and their belongings out of city parks. In our fourth story tonight, protesters from Denver to Rochester standing their ground in a federal court today, siding with the protesters in Nashville, ordering police there to stop making arrests. We start in Denver, where hundreds of police, reportedly armed with clubs, tear gas, pepper spray, and rubber bullets, moved into the Occupy site on Saturday after they say the crowd became unruly. Protesters bearing physical evidence of the confrontation, many displaying wounds from rubber bullets and pepper spray canisters. In all, 20 protesters were arrested.
It was very peaceful until somebody showed up with a bunch of weapons. Now, who was that? Oh, it was you guys.
Meanwhile, in Portland, Oregon, protesters facing off against police dressed in riot gear. The officers declared the Pearl District Park closed at midnight, then arrested 25 protesters who refused to leave. The Portland Police Department then took the unprecedented, though apparently not illegal, step of posting mugshots and names of arrested protesters on Facebook. No indication whether they had any motivation for doing so beyond shaming the protesters. Portland Mayor Sam Adams saying that while he's been supportive of the protests so far, he's not happy with the direction they've taken, then criticizing the movement for, he says, straying from its core mission.
I look forward to the Occupy movement's next phase, next iteration, of really finding a way to act on its core mission.
Certainly that will be aided by posting their photos online. To Nashville, where there were also mass arrests over the weekend. We reported Friday protesters were standing their ground in defiance of a police order to vacate the park. Over the weekend, troopers arrested about 50 protesters. Today, the American Civil Liberties Union of Tennessee filed a lawsuit on behalf of Occupy Nashville protesters who were arrested on Friday, seeking a temporary restraining order against Governor Bill Haslam, writing, "The government chose a metaphorical shotgun to kill a fly." This afternoon, good news for the protesters. Tennessee officials agreed to stop enforcing curfew and arresting protesters. In other cities, though, the arrests continue. Rochester, New York, 32 arrested Friday night after the group refused to leave a downtown park there. In Austin, Texas, 37 protesters arrested last night. More than a dozen met with city and police officials today to discuss the incident. Meanwhile, about a dozen protesters arrested in a public park in Richmond, Virginia, where Occupy members had been camping since October 15th. After police evacuated the area, the remaining belongings, which included not just tents, but also a makeshift library and a volleyball court, were scooped up by bulldozers and deposited in dump trucks. And in Kansas, the hotbed of liberalism, 100 protesters marched on Koch industry headquarters in Wichita on Saturday, the company owned by oil billionaires Charles and David Koch, who are some of the far right's biggest funders.
Lots of money has been put into our political system to buy votes, and so I think you go where the money is, which is here, right here.
And lastly, to Oakland, where you will remember that last week, 24-year-old Iraq War veteran Marine Scott Olson suffered a fractured skull after police fired tear gas canisters into the crowd. He was told over the weekend of the international support for him. Still not speaking, he gave a thumbs-up sign. Hundreds of protesters marching through the streets of Oakland Saturday night to protest police brutality as officers in riot gear lined the streets and helicopters again hovered overhead. Let's talk about Denver, and I'm joined from there by Jeannie Hartley, who witnessed those unruly, that word is in quotes, protesters on Saturday. Thanks for your time tonight.
Thank you so much, Keith, for having me here.
Tell me about...
Much appreciated.
You're very welcome. Tell me about the scene on Saturday. The protesters were described as unruly. Are the police being truthful in that statement?
I have to tell you, to be honest, I have to tell you what I saw.
Okay.
What I witnessed was not anyone being unruly. What I saw was several police officers chasing en masse into the park, running towards a man in a tree, one little guy in a tree, and then chasing after another man and throwing him down onto the ground and putting him in a chokehold with officers surrounding him. I saw tear gas being dispersed. I saw rubber pellets, these pepper spray pellets, being shot into the crowd towards people that, from my vision, were not being unruly. To be fair, I couldn't see everything that was going on everywhere. But from where I was standing, the people were not being unruly at all. We'd had a perfectly peaceful march, a perfectly peaceful rally, and it turned into something much worse.
Lieutenant Matt Murray was quoted in the Denver Post as saying, "We're reacting to what they do as long as they are legally protesting. We'll protect their right to do that." The officers today did a great job of showing restraint. And yet something was tweeted today, which I think seems apropos in this. When figuring out who's looking for a riot, check to see who came dressed for one. Did you have a sense of the police instigation merely by preparation? I think I may have just made that up on the spot, but I think you know what I'm saying here. That if you go ahead.
I think that was very well put, just the way you said it, Keith. First of all, it was extraordinary the amount of police force that were present before anything was, by their definition, I'm guessing, unruly. Mm-hmm. I mean, the governor complained a week or so before that we cost the $365,000 to the city of Denver. It was his decision to release that mass of force to be available in the park. It's my understanding that he's claiming now that the cost was $500,000. They had hundreds of police force, Keith, surrounding a food table. Hundreds of them in riot gear. This was an unnecessary expense to Denver by far.
As I just mentioned, protesters in Nashville were successful in the courts. Is there any thought of going to the courts in Denver or to the state courts in some way?
Yes, that is actually something that is in the works. We have a legal team, an amazing legal team, I must say. We're also working with the National Lawyers Guild, and there are things in the works. I can't address that specifically because I'm not an attorney, but I can promise you that efforts are being made towards that end, to be sure.
Give me a philosophical answer to this one, if you can, Ms. Hartley. The mess we saw in Oakland, the smaller messes we've seen in New York and elsewhere, how is it that rather than taking the prudent method of suffering the protests as best they could, everybody involved in a government somewhere or a police department somewhere or at a state level somewhere seems to think that the best way to make this go away is to provide all the videotape that any news broadcaster could ever want to show ordinary citizens getting pummeled by police. Has that occurred to you yet, how ridiculous a response this is purely from a public relations standpoint?
Yes, it is. And I also think that on a grander scale of things, which makes that even more absurd, is that people have taken to the streets because of so many injustices that have been in place for far too long. You know, with the issues of the underwater mortgages and the corporate greed and the student loans, $100,000 student loans, and they graduate from college and there's no jobs in sight. And the cost of the wars, unending costs of precious lives. People are in the streets because of injustice. So for the police force to inflict more injustice upon us is not going to make us leave the streets. It's going to make more people come into the streets.
Well said. Jeannie Hartley from Occupy Denver, great thanks for some of your time tonight.
Thank you so much, Keith.
Then there is New York, where Occupy is buffeted by the seizure of its generators, by the weather, and by reports that the New York police are directing, perhaps even bringing, substance abusers among New York's homeless to Zuccotti Park. Next.